History is often written in ink, but the history of the Wild West was written in blood. And sometimes the ink and the blood tell two very different stories. We are taught from grade school that the book closed on Jesse Woodson James on April 3rd, 1882. We are told the legendary outlaw was shot in the back of the head by the coward Robert Ford in a rented house in St. Joseph, Missouri. We are told he was buried, mourned, and that the era of the outlaw rider died with him. But there is a ghost story that has haunted the American frontier for over 70 years. A story that suggests the man in the coffin was a fraud, and the real Jesse James rode away into the sunset to live for another half-century. This mystery doesn't begin in the 19th century, but in the middle of the 20th. It begins on a humid night in 1948 in a hospital room in Lawton, Oklahoma. An old man lay in a bed, his skin weathered like cracked leather, his breathing rattling in his chest. The medical charts said his name was Frank Dalton, and he was over 100 years old. For years, the locals knew him as a storyteller, a man who claimed to be a distant uncle of the Dalton gang, a relic of a bygone era. But on this night, facing his own mortality, the old man summoned the local press and made a confession that would set the historical world on fire. He looked the reporters in the eye and told them that history had it wrong. He said that he was not Frank Dalton. He said his name was Jesse James.
They said I was
Most
dead,
people laughed.
buried back
Every
in
old
82.
drifter in Texas and Oklahoma seemed to claim they were Billy the Kid or Jesse James after a few whiskeys. But Frank Dalton was different. He didn't just have a story. He had the map of the outlaw's life carved into his own skin. When doctors and historians began to examine the old man, the laughter died down, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. Jesse James was known to have a very specific set of scars from his violent life, and Frank Dalton had every single one of them. The first piece of evidence was a bullet wound in the right side of the chest. During the Civil War, a Union soldier had shot the teenage Jesse James, collapsing his lung. It was a wound that plagued him for the rest of his life. Frank Dalton had a massive ancient scar in the exact same spot on his right chest, consistent with a Civil War-era ball. The second piece of evidence was even more gruesome. During the war, Union soldiers had once captured the young Jesse and interrogated him to find the location of his guerrilla unit. When he refused to talk, they placed a noose around his neck and hanged him from a tree in a cornfield. They pulled him up and down, choking him near to death before cutting him loose. This torture left a distinct, jagged rope-burn scar around his neck that he hid under high collars for the rest of his days. When the examiners in 1948 asked Frank Dalton to lift his chin, there it was, a deep, undeniable ring of scarred tissue around his neck, the mark of a man who had survived a hanging 80 years prior. Finally, there was the missing finger. It was a well-documented fact that Jesse James was missing the tip of the middle finger on his left hand, the result of a gun-cleaning accident years before his death. Frank Dalton laid his left hand on the hospital sheet, and the tip of the middle finger was gone. Scars can be coincidental, but a bullet wound, a rope burn, and a missing fingertip, all matching the exact description of America's most famous fugitive? The odds were astronomical. To understand how Jesse James could be alive in 1948, we have to go back to that fateful morning in 1882. The official narrative tells us that Jesse was living under the alias Thomas Howard with his wife and children. The Ford brothers, Bob and Charlie, were staying with him, plotting to collect the $10,000 reward on his head. The story goes that it was a hot morning, and Jesse, complaining of the heat, did something he never did. He unbuckled his gun belt and laid his revolvers on the bed. He then stepped up on a chair to dust a picture of a racehorse named Skyrocket. It was then that Bob Ford drew his pearl-handled revolver and shot Jesse behind the right ear. It is a clean, dramatic ending, but historians have always been bothered by the details. Jesse James was a man of extreme paranoia. He had survived 20 years of being hunted by the Pinkertons, the railroads, and the U.S. Army. He slept with his guns. He ate with his guns. The idea that he would disarm himself in the presence of the Ford brothers, men he had already begun to suspect were traitors, seems incredibly out of character. The theory put forth by Frank Dalton and his supporters is known as the Bigelow Deception. The story goes that Jesse James had discovered a man named Charles Bigalow, a minor outlaw and drifter who bore a striking physical resemblance to the gang leader. Jesse, realizing the walls were closing in, hatched a plan. He would kill Bigalow, or have him killed, and dress the body in his own clothes. He would plant his own watch, his own ring, and his own guns on the corpse. The Ford brothers were in on the scheme, agreeing to the fake assassination in exchange for the reward money and a pardon, while Jesse would escape with the bulk of the gang's buried gold to start a new life.
What do we have here?
There were anomalies at the time that support this. When the coroner arrived at the house in St. Joseph, the body was reported to be surprisingly decomposed for a man who had only been dead for an hour. The face was swollen and discolored. When Jesse's mother, the formidable Zerelda James, arrived at the scene, witnesses reported a strange reaction. She looked at the body on the floor and screamed, "My God, it isn't him!" It was only later, after speaking with others in the room, that she calmed down and publicly identified the body as her son. Was that initial scream a mother's intuition failing to recognize a stranger? Or was it a slip of the tongue that she had to quickly correct to protect her living son? If the man in the grave was Charles Bigalow, then Jesse James headed south. Frank Dalton claimed he spent decades living under various aliases in South America and Texas, working as a cowboy, a shrinking violet in the shadow of his own legend. He claimed he even served as a U.S. Marshal for a time, a supreme irony for the nation's most wanted man.
This right here, this proves everything I've been
When
telling
Frank Dalton went public in 1948, he didn't just bring scars, he brought secrets. He knew the intimate layout of the old James family farm, including the location of underground tunnels and hidden compartments that had been sealed for 50 years. He knew the nicknames of gang members that had never been published in the dime novels or newspapers. He spoke with the cadence and vocabulary of a man from the 1860s, using phrases that had long since fallen out of the American lexicon. He was a living time capsule. The old man died in 1951, 3 years after his confession, and was buried in Granbury, Texas. His tombstone reads simply, Jesse Woodson James. But the story didn't end there. The controversy simmered for decades, dividing historians and families. Finally, in 1995, science stepped in to settle the debate once and for all. A forensic team, led by Professor James Starrs, was granted permission to exhume the official grave of Jesse James in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Missouri. The exhumation was a media circus, hampered by rain and mud. When they finally reached the coffin, they found it had disintegrated. The body was largely gone, reduced to bone fragments and mush. However, they managed to recover 2 teeth. The team extracted mitochondrial DNA from the teeth and compared it to blood samples from living descendants of Jesse's sister, Susan James. The result was announced to the world, a 99.7% probability that the teeth belonged to a relation of the James family. The scientific consensus declared the case closed. The body in Missouri was Jesse James. But true believers in the Dalton theory were not swayed. They pointed out the obvious flaws in the 1995 investigation. They argued that if Jesse James had faked his death, he would have been thorough. If you are planting a body to fool the authorities, and you have a look-alike corpse, pulling a few teeth from your own mouth to plant in the grave with the imposter is a small price to pay for freedom. They argued that loose teeth found in the dirt proved nothing about the identity of the body itself. So the focus shifted to Texas. In the year 2000, another team received a court order to exhume the body of J. Frank Dalton in the Granbury Cemetery. If his DNA matched the James family, it would rewrite American history. But this exhumation proved to be a disaster of epic proportions. The cemetery records were a mess. When the team dug up the grave marked for Dalton, they found the remains of a one-armed man. They had dug up the wrong body. Frustrated but undeterred, they used ground-penetrating radar to locate another coffin nearby. They dug again. This time, they found a body that matched Dalton's description, an extremely old man with a missing fingertip. They took samples for DNA testing. The world waited. But unlike the Missouri dig, the results from Texas were anticlimactic. The DNA was too degraded. The samples were inconclusive. The silver bullet that would have proven the 100-year-old man was the outlaw king dissolved in the lab. We are left, then, with a choice. On one hand, we have the official record, supported by DNA evidence from a couple of teeth, stating that Jesse James died young, betrayed by his own gang. On the other hand, we have J. Frank Dalton, a man who possessed the physical map of Jesse's life on his body, who knew secrets only the outlaw could know, and whose grave in Texas still attracts pilgrims who believe the legend outlived the history book. There is a psychological reason we are drawn to the story of J. Frank Dalton. We don't want our heroes, or even our anti-heroes, to die dirty deaths on a living room floor. We want to believe that the cleverest fox in the woods can't be caught by a trap. We want to believe that Jesse James, the Robin Hood of the Reconstruction, was smart enough to pull one last fast one on the Pinkertons and the governor. We want the outlaw to ride away. Whether J. Frank Dalton was the real Jesse James or the greatest method actor of the 20th century remains a mystery buried in the Texas dirt. But he proved one thing that remains true to this day. You can kill the man. You can bury the body. But you can never quite kill the ghost. The legend of Jesse James is not just about a man who robbed trains. It is about a spirit of defiance that refused to stay in the grave. And perhaps, just perhaps, that spirit lived on in an old man in Oklahoma, laughing at the world one last time. Thanks for watching, and if you made it to the end, please like and subscribe and drop a comment. Much appreciated.